Apollo Cesa was born in 1811. He is Mary and Cornelius Cesa's first child. In 1828, he married a woman named Greta. They had 2 children together. A boy named Ezekiel, who was born in 1830. Then another boy in 1835. His name was Samuel. Apollo and Greta spent most of their time taking care of the kids. Apollo's sister Canela had also helped them before she moved out. Apollo didn't want to miss a moment with his children. He was around the same age his father died, and wanted his kids to remember him in case he suddenly passed. Every night before bed he read his father's book to them. This piqued Ezekiel's interest in books early. He was a quiet young boy who kept to himself. Samuel had a lot more energy. He was becoming quite the charmer. Despite being opposites, the boys were the best of friends. The family was inseparable. Apollo did his best to give them a good childhood. That included going on trips. One trip in particular had to be cut short. Samuel wasn't feeling well, so they returned home. There he was given cough syrup, in hopes that the cold would go down. But he wasn't getting any better. He remained in his bed as his illness grew worse. Apollo knew what was next for his son. He didn't want to see Samuel in that state, so he kept his distance. Meanwhile, Greta never left her son's side. She wished there was more she could do. She argued with Apollo for not being there for Samuel when he needed him most. They argued every day. Between their arguments and Samuel's illness, Ezekiel had many sleepless nights. Greta held her son the day he took his last breath. Samuel Cesa passed away in 1840. He was just 5 years old. After his passing, the family moved into a new home. Apollo and Greta didn't speak much to each other anymore. Neither of them did. Because the family was broken, Ezekiel spent a lot of time in his room. There he stayed for the next few years. At a certain age, he became bored of the same old thing. He spent more time outside of the house. There he met a girl named Linda. She was adventurous. She made him feel happy again. But his father didn't approve of her. Apollo felt that she was a bad influence. Ezekiel didn't care what his father thought. He was in love, and that was all that mattered. Right after he proposed, they decided to run away together. Before they did, Ezekiel told his parents he was getting married, and that was final. His mother was happy for him, but his father was still upset. They got into an argument before Ezekiel decided to leave for good. He went to meet Linda but couldn't find her. Then he saw her in an altercation with another man. Ezekiel jumped in to protect her and fought the criminal. But the man had a weapon and used it against him. Ezekiel fell lifeless to the floor. Linda tried to call for help, but the man got to her before anyone could. Ezekiel was barely alive when the man killed her. That was the last thing he saw. He passed away in 1848 at 18 years old. Apollo was devastated at the loss of another child. He never expected his children to go before him. Not long after Ezekiel's death, Greta had met her fate. Apollo had spent the next 10 years waiting for his turn. Finally, in 1860, he was reunited with his family again. Canela Williams was born in 1817. She is the second child of Cornelius and Mary Cesa. In 1835, she was married to a man named Stuart D. Williams. The two of them lived happily. They spent a lot of time reading together. In 1840, Canela's nephew had passed away. His death shook the entire family. That same year, Canela had a little girl. Her name was Jasmine. Having her around helped Canela grieve. But she also worried that her daughter would suffer the same illness. In 1840, Canela had another baby girl named Dahlia. Then in 1843 they had one more girl. Her name was Lily. Because the girls were close in age, they got along very well. They played together every day. Canela read her father's book to them along with others. As the girls grew older, they had become even closer. Jasmine and Dahlia had become best friends. Canela would knit whenever she had the time. She started teaching her daughters the same. Around this time, Canela's brother Apollo had lost his wife and child. She invited him over to console him. The girls had met him for the first time. Being around them made him feel worse. Canela wanted him to stay so he wasn't lonely, but Apollo preferred to be alone. After he left, he never returned. Canela continued to live happily with her family. The girls were getting older and had become more interested in boys. Lily was following in her older sister's footsteps, but she was a lot more naive than them, which led her to a lot of heartbreak. With the girls grown with their own lives, Canela and Stuart spent more time alone together. In 1860, Apollo had passed away. Canela visited his grave every day. Other than that, she and Stuart spent the rest of their days reading and knitting. Edgar Cesa was born in 1837. He is author Cesa's only child. Shortly after he was born, they fled to a different country. There, author had given himself a new name to keep his identity hidden. His new name was Jim Takahashi, but at home he was just author. Author stayed low and remained at a cottage with his family. Edgar was learning quicker than most babies. He started crawling at 4 months. By 6 months he was already walking. Author knew how special he was. He taught him about science at a very early age. By the time Edgar was 5 years old, he knew every element. He certainly was a brilliant child. His intelligence only grew as he aged. Author had further taught him about the world of science and technology. That Edgar was more curious on the world outside. For as long as he could remember, he's been inside. Author explained that the world could not accept him. Therefore, he had to stay hidden. Edgar had no choice but to believe his father. So they continued his studies. Every day, Author would quiz Edgar on his knowledge before teaching him something new. His afternoons consisted of reading and crafting. As he improved, Author shared his ideas with him. In 1848, Author had passed of an unknown illness. After his death, Edgar was left in the care of C. the 3000. Cesa continued Author's teaching. Edgar wanted to know if he could finally leave the house. Cesa informed him that he could not go out simply because he wasn't human. But he discovered that he had the ability to appear as though he was. One morning he noticed Cesa was undergoing repairs. So he put on his disguise and went out for the first time. He was amazed by how fresh the air was. He had touched snow for the very first time. He wanted to see more, so he traveled on. He came across a group of children around his age and attempted to make friends. He thought they were getting along, but they had said some hurtful things. They had really hurt his feelings. Edgar went home and was comforted by Cesa. After confessing where he'd been, he decided not to leave home again. Instead, he continued what he was taught. A few years had gone by and Edgar had grown even smarter. He had a book full of formulas and ideas. With all his knowledge, he was able to give Cesa an upgrade. He also improved his alien abilities. During this time, Edgar started to go outside more often. He made an effort to avoid people. One day, while he was exploring, he noticed someone doing the same. He felt it was a new opportunity to make a friend. But when he saw her face, he realized she was the same girl who bullied him in the past. The girl apologized to him and asked to start over. He agreed. Her name was Maki, and she was his first real friend. They spent a lot of time together. Edgar soon told her his secret. Maki was skeptical until he showed his true form. He expected her to fear him, but she didn't. She was fascinated by him. Their friendship had blossomed into love, and they were married in 1860. They moved into a bigger house soon after. Since Maki was comfortable with his looks, Edgar no longer disguised himself. In 1861, Maki had given birth to their child, a little boy named Ikiro. Since Edgar was half human, Ikiro was completely human. Edgar didn't love his son any different, but he felt like an outcast. So he wore his disguise to blend in with his family. Cesa helped with the baby whenever Maki needed rest. Meanwhile, Edgar continued his father's work. He tried to contact aliens to find others like him. One night, he was taken. He was brought to a strange new world, where there were people like him. Even with his disguise, they welcomed him with open arms. They told him he was born into the planet to research what life was like. With his new knowledge, he could help make their planet better. Edgar wanted to stay and help, but there was one thing he had to do. He returned home to his wife and child to erase their memories of him. It was a difficult decision to make, but he didn't want to pretend he was human anymore. When he returned to his home planet, he used his knowledge of science to help make it better. After a few years, Edgar had found love again. He was happier to be with someone like him, and he wouldn't change it for anything. Romeo Valentino was born in 1820. He is Prudence and Mario Valentino's only child. From the moment he was born, his future was set in stone. His father had died just before his birth, leaving his mother to handle the family business. As Romeo grew older, his mother and uncles prepared him to someday take care of the business. They all spent a lot of time together. Giuseppe and Alfredo are the only father figures Romeo had. He was very close with them. Romeo was also close with his mother. Every year they would visit his father's grave, and his mother would play the violin. She always told him how similar he was to his father. In 1836, when Romeo was 16, his mother had passed the business down to him. He took his responsibilities very seriously. He kept in shape in case anyone ever tried him. He even started a liquor company to help keep the business discreet. In 1844, Romeo met a woman named Bianca. They were married that next year. Most of his days consisted of working and going on dates. As time progressed, Romeo started offering protection for local businesses. With all the money coming in, he renovated the house. In 1846, Bianca and Romeo were expecting. To celebrate, he gifted her the puppy she always wanted. A few months later, they welcomed home their little boy Ramian. Romeo introduced him to his uncles. The little boy would someday lead the family business, as his father once had. For now, Ramian stayed at home with his mother and grandmother. Romeo continued to work in the business and made more money. In 1848, they had a baby girl named Pippa. With the success of his business, Romeo was able to spend more time at home with his family. In 1850, he and Bianca were having another baby. However, that year Romeo was arrested after helping a dirty politician. Prudence helped care for her grandchildren while Bianca rested. Romeo was still in prison when Bianca gave birth to their daughter. She named her Sophia. Eventually, Romeo's uncles came to help her out with the children. They kept an eye on the family while Romeo was away. What was supposed to be a few months became years. In 1855, after 5 years of incarceration, Romeo finally came home. The family happily welcomed him back. He thanked his uncles for keeping his family safe, but his daughters didn't even know him. Romeo spent his first year back with his mother, wife and children. When he finally returned to work, he brought Romeon with him. Even after returning to work, Romeo always made time for his family. He didn't want to miss another moment. Once there lived a young couple, a woman named Angelina and a man named Philip. They had 2 children together, Atticus, who was 8 years old, and Johnny, who was 5. They were a normal, happy family. But after falling into debt, things changed. The only way to pay it off was to work for the family they owed it to. They could not bring their children, so the boys were taken in by another family. They were instructed to cook, clean, and fix whatever was broken. By the end of each day, they were too exhausted to speak with one another. Whenever they did, it was always an argument. Angelina resented Philip for putting their family into debt, even if he didn't mean for any of it to happen. Because of him, they would never see their children again. Evangeline Herring was born in 1823. She is Beatrice Porter's only child. Beatrice was not allowed to keep her daughter when she was born, so she brought her to a place and left her. Angelina discovered the newborn and adopted her. Her and Philip named the baby Evangeline. She was exactly what the couple needed. Because they weren't allowed to have children, they kept her presence a secret. As the years went on, it became harder to hide her. In 1834, Beatrice visited the family and told them why she had to leave her daughter behind. The couple was sympathetic until she asked to have Evangeline back. They dismissed her for such a request. They would never give their daughter away. Days later, the couple returned home from work to find Evangeline gone. They didn't know she was taken by her birth mother. While they searched for her, Beatrice told her everything. Evangeline had known her parents weren't her birth parents, but she still wanted to be with them. She demanded to be returned to her family, until Beatrice finally caved. Her parents were relieved to have her home safe. Beatrice left and never returned. However, shortly after that, they received an unexpected visit from their boss. Evangeline was frightened, but they managed to get her to hide in time. When they were ready, they let the man in. When they asked what he wanted, he didn't answer. He started looking around in search for something. Angelina grew nervous watching him. When he found nothing, he confronted them about seeing a child. He reminded them that children weren't allowed and would only put them in further debt. Philip promised him that there was no child there, with no proof of otherwise. Their boss had no choice but to believe them. After he left, they worried he would return. They decided to leave that night. Felipes scouted ahead after he promised to meet them at the river. They then left shortly after. They traveled through the woods until they finally reached the river. When they didn't see Felipes, they waited for him. After a while, they started to worry. Angelina told her to go ahead while she went to find him. She told her if they didn't return by sunlight, to leave without them. Evangeline didn't want to, but she had no choice. After a goodbye, they went their separate ways. Evangeline went further until she found the boat. When the sun began to rise, Evangeline realized her parents weren't coming back. She got on the boat alone and sailed down the current. A few days later, she found herself somewhere new. She was noticed by a woman and called over. The stranger asked why she was alone, and Evangeline told her everything. The woman took her in and gave her a place to stay. Evangeline was grateful, but missed her parents. She spent a lot of time mourning their loss in her room. The woman, whose name was Christiane Lefleur, gave her the space she needed. When Evangeline was starting to come around, she noticed something strange about Christiane. She discovered that she was a witch. Christiane happily told her about her craft. Evangeline was fascinated and followed everything she did. There wasn't much she could follow, since she didn't contain such gifts. That was until she met someone with an even greater power. His name was Sebastian, and he was a vampire visiting a friend. The two had fallen in love. Sebastian introduced her to his vampire friends. Evangeline was fascinated by the vampire's abilities and wanted to live as long as they did. She asked Sebastian to turn her, and he did. Christiane wasn't very supportive in her decision. So Evangeline decided to go with Sebastian back to his hometown. There they were married in 1855. They spent many happy years alone together. In 1868, their family expanded. Evangeline had a little girl named Esther. Then in 1870 they had a son. His name was Vincent. Since they were all vampires, they would get to live for eternity. Vincent Cain Vaughan Taylor was born in 1817. He is Jane and Cain Vaughan Taylor's only child. He was a very calm and quiet baby. His mother was very protective over him. That didn't change as he grew. However, with his father it was different. They had an extremely difficult relationship. Vincent was always trying to get a rise out of him. Sometimes Bartholomew reacted too far. Vincent would then tell his mother what he did to him. Then Jane would argue with Bartholomew, even when he tried to explain himself. She didn't want to hear it. Jane always chose Vincent's side over his. He could do no wrong in his mother's eyes, and he took advantage of that. In 1831, Jane had become bedridden by an illness. She spent days motionless in bed. Vincent hated the sight of his mother in such state. He was with her when she took her last breath. She passed away in 1833. Her death further estranged Vincent and Bartholomew's relationship. They always argued. The only thing that kept them from killing each other was distance. Bartholomew started to drink to cope with Jane's death. A few years passed. In 1840, Bartholomew was remarried. The young woman's name was Amelia. Around this time, Vincent spent most of his time drinking and hooking up. He was with a different girl every night. One night at a ball, Vincent and Amelia shared a dance. Bartholomew kept a close eye on them. When he lost track of them, he knew something was up. He had caught them together doing what he feared. He confronted Amelia, who belittled the situation. Infuriated, he fought Vincent. Bartholomew went through so much stress that he had a heart attack. Amelia found him and was able to get him help. While he was on bed rest, she continued to fool around with Vincent. But that didn't last when Vincent met someone else. Her name was Penelope, and she wanted nothing to do with him. No matter how much Vincent would pry, she wouldn't give him a chance. They would argue a lot because of it. Eventually, Penelope started to fall for him. They were married in 1845. During that time, Amelia left and was remarried to someone else. Bartholomew remained alone in his room, only receiving visits from his doctor. Vincent went ahead to forge a will so that he gets everything. When Bartholomew dies, he and his wife spent the next few years partying and being in love. In 1850, they were expecting. They had twins, Harold and Bernard. The twins were mostly raised by the nanny and butler, while Penelope and Vincent enjoyed each other. Every now and then they would check in on them. In 1855, Bartholomew passed of a heart condition. He was buried beside Jane like he wanted. And in his will, he left everything to Vincent, just like he planned. Coraline Harbor was born in 1827. She is Genevieve and Dimitri Harbor's second child. Ever since she was a girl, she had a gift. She could see what others couldn't. There were always strange things happening around the house. It made Genevieve incredibly nervous. She was afraid of Coraline's gift, so she would lock her in the attic room. Coraline would scream and cry until her father came home. Dimitri couldn't believe Genevieve had done such a thing. Genevieve refused to stop until the strange activity came to an end. So he made Coraline promise not to talk to any more spirits. While Coraline may not have spoke to them, they were still there. She ignored them until they no longer made their presence known. She spent more time with her big sister Charlotte. The two of them were best friends. Coraline was devastated when her sister went missing. She waited every night for her to come back. Dimitri reassured her that he would bring Charlotte back. He spent a lot of time searching for her. He had asked everyone in town if they had seen her, and took all the help he could get. He blamed Genevieve for the way she treated the children. It was her fault Charlotte was gone. Dimitri spent more and more time looking for his daughter. No matter how exhausted he was, he refused to give up. The days turned into years. Coraline was still at home with her mother. They didn't speak much. They were afraid of each other. The night her sister went missing, Coraline had a bad feeling about dinner. She told Charlotte before they sat down to eat. Then she left. Coraline blamed herself for her sister's disappearance for years. Now that she was older, she was more afraid of what her mother was capable of. Staying out of her way kept her from getting in trouble. With all the time to herself, she was reconnected with the ghosts around her. Genevieve noticed her strange behavior. Paranoid, Genevieve decided to handle it before it got worse. She slapped her and locked her into the attic. Coraline cried and cried. This time, her father wasn't around to save her. Locking her away made things worse around the house. There was never a moment of peace. So Genevieve let Coraline out. After she left, The lights shut off and the door locked behind her. There, Genevieve was tortured by the spirits. It was then that Dimitri came home. He was ashamed that he still hadn't found Charlotte. He spent years feeling guilty for not being there for his daughter. He passed away of a broken heart in 1845. Genevieve was still locked in the attic. That same year, she also died from mysterious causes. Coraline was left alone, but not completely. One night, she awoke from her sleep to someone in her room. It was Charlotte. Coraline was so happy to see her again. Charlotte told Coraline what happened to her. After she ran away, she stayed in the woods to keep out of the rain. But the rain never stopped, and she couldn't remember the way she came. She was lost, alone and afraid. Too scared to go home, she ate whatever looked edible to survive. After a few days, she fell incredibly ill. She never got to find help. The next day, Coraline went to the place her sister told her about and found her. After 12 years, the mystery was solved. Coraline had passed away at 10 years old in 1835. Everyone attended her funeral. The neighborhood was devastated. Coraline was sad that her sister suffered so much, but she was relieved she got to bury her. After that night, she never saw her sister again. She knew that Charlotte was at peace, and that put her at peace. In 1850, she met a man named Herbert. The two of them had fallen in love with each other. They did everything together. That after a day in the rain, tragedy struck. Herbert was gone. Coraline was left alone once again. Shortly after his death, she found out she was pregnant. In 1851, she gave birth to twins, Lucy and Mabel. Coraline wasn't at all ready for motherhood, but she would try to be a better mother than hers. Joan Kiama was born in 1834. She is Sarah and Jonathan Kiama's only child. For as long as she can remember, it's just been her and her dad. Since Joan didn't have a mother, Jonathan did everything with her. For a long time it had been just them. But that soon changed when he met someone new. Her name was Carol. They were married in 1849. Joan welcomed her stepmother with open arms. Carol was incredibly kind and loving. She couldn't have children of her own. That made Joan a daughter she always wanted. They were all happy together. Jonathan and Carol were Joan's biggest supporters. As she grew older, she spent less time with her parents. She would either read or hang out with her best friend Damien. The two of them were always on an adventure together. They were two peas in a pod. Her father liked having him around. He thought they would get married. But Joan was far more interested in someone else. His name was Jude Sterling, and he was loved by all. Every girl in town wanted to be with him, and he wanted to be with every girl. Joan was too naive to see who he truly was. Her father didn't approve of him at all. Her parents had a talk with her about his influence, but Joan didn't listen. She remained with Jude no matter what her parents told her. It wasn't long before she discovered the truth on her own. She went home never wanting to see him again. Her parents were there to comfort her broken heart. She spent days in her room being heartbroken. Damien visited to try and cheer her up. He even got her a gift. He showered her with more love than Jude ever had. That made Joan realize how lucky she was to have him. Before their romance could begin, Joan discovered she was pregnant. Jonathan wasn't very happy about the news, but he would still support his daughter. Damien was also upset by the news but promised to help whenever she needed. The last person to tell was Jude. Because having a child out of wedlock was shunned, they were obligated to marry. Neither of them were happy about this. Joan wished she listened to her parents when they warned her. Most importantly, she wished she was with Damien. They didn't even get to truly be together. After the marriage, they moved into a new estate in 1852. They soon welcomed home their son Walter. Joan introduced him to her parents. They were excited to meet the new addition. After Walter was born, Joan tried to fix things with Jude. But Jude still pursued others. Of course, Jane discovered what he was doing and was upset, but Jude would always brush it off. No matter how much they would argue over the years, he would never change. All Joan wanted was for him to love her and her alone. Since that would never be the case, she focused on raising her son. Sometimes Damien would come over to help, whenever her husband was off with another woman. Sometimes they would remember what almost was to them. While things didn't exactly go as they wanted, they would still love each other regardless. Isabella Inmortui was born in 1845. She is Gustav and Victoria Inmortui's only child. Unlike her father, Isabella was not a vampire. Since she was a baby, there was nothing that could be done. But he talked to Victoria about becoming a vampire, so they could spend an eternity together. She expressed that she didn't want to live forever, and that she just wanted to be healthy. He even tried having his friends convince her, but nothing worked. Gustav couldn't deal with knowing his family would grow old without him, so he cherished every moment with them. Victoria raised Isabella to be educated on health and proper eating habits. As she grew older, Victoria taught her how to cook and care for plants. Gustav taught her how to play the organ. She had a good relationship with both of her parents. When she was 15 years old, she fell in love. His name was Patrick, and he was wonderful. He was kind to her in more ways than one. He also got along with her parents. When he asked for their blessing, they were happy to give it to him. They even helped set the scene for the proposal. They were married in 1863. That same year, they found out they were having a baby. The family was excited to hear about it. A few months later, the baby was born. A little girl named Vivian. She had quickly become everyone's favorite. When she was just a few months old, Patrick fell sick. He was given cough syrup to feel better. While it worked for a while, he soon got progressively worse. He was put in a separate room, where Isabella refused to leave his side. Victoria worked non-stop to create a cure. He had the same disease her brother did. She promised Isabella that she would help him. While all of that was going on, Gustav took care of Vivian. One night, Isabella found Patrick unresponsive. She refused to believe he was gone. Patrick Inmortui passed away in 1864. Victoria felt guilty for not finding a cure in time. Isabella would never recover from her husband's loss. Her parents felt so helpless. Victoria never stopped looking for a cure. She didn't want anyone else to die from that disease. She would unfortunately pass after using a harmful ingredient in her new recipe. She died in 1868 at 45 years old. Gustav couldn't believe she was gone so soon. He wished she let him turn her when he had the chance. In fear of losing his daughter, he asked her if she wanted to be like him. Isabella declined. If she was a vampire, she would never get to see her husband again. Gustav was disappointed, but she had a point. There was no joy in living an eternity without his family. So he made it his mission to become immortal. In 1872, Isabella's broken heart had taken its toll. She passed in her sleep at 27 years old. All that remained of her now was her daughter. Eloise Hathaway was born in 1839. She is Gertrude and Charles Hathaway's first child. Eloise had a good childhood. Her parents always made sure she felt loved, especially since she was the only girl in the house. As a teenager, she found more interest in partying and spending time with friends. She always got along better with boys and girls. In 1857, she met a man named Anton. He was everything to her. There wasn't a day they wouldn't spend together. Their deep love for one another was real. But after months of nirvana, Anton disappeared. Around this time, Eloise discovered she was pregnant. She didn't know where Anton was but needed to find him. She told her parents, and while they weren't happy, they would support her and her child. She asked around to find out where Anton may be. She discovered where he lived and how incredibly wealthy he was. When she entered his home, she was greeted by a couple. She asked about Anton, and they told her that he was their son, and he was out with his wife. Anton was secretly engaged during their affairs, and didn't tell her about it. Heartbroken, she told them to tell him they need to talk before going home. Later that night, Anton paid her a visit. Eloise couldn't believe that he was married to another woman. Anton explained that his parents arranged for the marriage, and that she was the one he truly loved. She didn't want to believe him. That when he begged her for forgiveness, she couldn't help giving him a second chance. They then went inside, where she told him that she was pregnant. Anton was devastated to hear it. He told her his parents could not find out about the baby, or they would never let her see them. Eloise promised not to tell, but hated that her child had to be kept a secret. All she wanted was to raise their baby together. As the months went by, Anton made time to visit her. Despite the circumstances, he still supported her. They were still madly in love, but sometimes it was just too much for her to handle. She was lucky to have her parents with her every step of the way. Anton wasn't there during her labor. It was her parents that helped deliver the baby. After the birth, while Eloise rested, her parents took care of her son. But they soon noticed that she wasn't breathing. It was then that Anton finally showed up. Distraught about Eloise's sudden death, they were infuriated to see him. Anton begged to see his child, but they wouldn't allow it. Gertrude blamed him for their daughter's death and forbid him from ever coming near their family again. Eloise Hathaway had passed away in 1858 at the age of 19. The family was devastated. So was Anton. He wished things had gone differently. Their son Xavier would grow up without either of his parents, but he was lucky enough to have a loving family to care for him. Anton would spend years feeling guilty for Eloise's death. Even though he had other children now, he would never stop trying to see his son. Henry Hathaway was born in 1840. He is Gertrude and Charles Hathaway's second child. As a boy, he was always competing with his brothers. They wanted to do everything he did, and they would follow him everywhere. It led to many fights and arguments. His father said it was because they looked up to him, much like he looked up to his sister. As their older brother, he had to set an example for them. It was his duty. After the death of his sister in 1858, he helped his parents take care of his nephew. The whole family contributed to raising him. Henry was a good influence on his brothers. He always did what he could to help around the house. His parents appreciated it. When he wasn't busy with his family, he spent time with someone special. Her name was Melinda, and Henry planned on marrying her. His life was simple, and that was how he liked it. In 1861, there was a mandatory draft for men all over the country. Henry and his father Charles were the exact ages required. It was difficult for them to accept, but there was nothing that could be done. Melinda hated that he had to go, but he promised he would come back to her. They said their farewells before they were sent away. The camp conditions were rough. Their first night there, Henry had caught something from the cot he slept in. They were training non-stop. Henry and his father grew closer in this time. They were grateful to have each other. They made friends with their colleagues too. Whenever Charles had the time, he would write letters to Gertrude. She read every single one of them. But that was all the calm before the storm. When it was finally time to fight, many died on the battlefield. They had to do what they were trained to. It was a bloodbath. Like many, Henry wasn't able to survive the fight. Charles couldn't believe his son was calm. He stayed with him all night. In the midst of mourning his son, he was captured. The family was met with yet another devastation. Henry Hathaway had passed away in 1862, and Charles was missing in action. Melinda was so heartbroken that she never showed her face again. Gertrude cried every night, hoping that her husband would someday return. But the war wasn't over yet, and Christopher was now old enough to be drafted. Christopher Hathaway was born in 1842. He is Gertrude and Charles Hathaway's third child. Christopher always knew how to light up the room. He loved to goof around and have fun. There was never a dull moment in the house. But after his brother's death, it was hard to lighten the mood, especially since he was next to be drafted. When it was time for him to leave, he said his goodbyes. Christopher was scared to be there at first. He feared he would suffer the same fate as his brother or father. Once training began, it became all about survival. Christopher felt if he was stronger, he would live. He trained day and night to prepare himself. His colleagues were impressed. He made friends with some of them. There was one individual that was more than a friend. His name was Tucker Hart. They were each other's escape. They kept their love a secret in fear of repercussion. Christopher had no problem killing on the battlefield. It was him, or them. Without meaning to, he started to like it. It was going well until he found out Tucker didn't make it. Something changed in Christopher. He was tired of losing everyone he loved to the enemy. He wanted justice. So he sought it. But in the process, he lost himself. Without Tucker, the base was lonely. Christopher didn't talk to anyone anymore, because it seemed like all their fates were the same. In 1864, Christopher's little brother John was drafted. Christopher was relieved to see a familiar face, but he was worried for him. John was petrified himself. He wasn't a fighter. He would break down during their training. Christopher knew if his brother didn't improve, he would die on the field. He tried to toughen him up. He showed him how to defend himself, but he still wasn't trying hard enough. Christopher told John that he was a coward and he was going to die. When it was time for the final battle, Christopher did what good soldiers do. In doing so, he lost his sanity. He wasn't surprised to find his brother severely wounded, but he managed to get him help. In 1865, the war had ended and Christopher had finally come home. His mother was happy to see him safe, but she noticed he was different. It was hard for him to live normally after all he had done. He didn't even want to be around his family, despite all the time he spent away from them. He moved out that year to a small place off-grid. There he would hunt to satisfy his urge to kill. That was how he lived until his death in 1896. Joan Hathaway was born in 1844. He is Gertrude and Charles Hathaway's fourth child. When he was little, he was always following his older brothers. He was especially close with his brother Christopher, even though he was always poking fun at him. John couldn't handle being drafted. He was lucky to be stationed with his brother Christopher. He had heard too many stories and didn't want to fight in a war. He struggled to keep up during training, and would sometimes break down and cry. His brother didn't believe he would make it. They would always argue. Christopher told him he was going to die, and that was the last time they spoke. When he was on the battlefield, he knew Christopher was right. With all the gunfire, it was hard to avoid getting hit. The next thing he knew, he was at a hospital. He didn't know how he got there, but he was scared and alone. There was something familiar about the man beside him. He looked just like his missing father. Upon further inspection, John realized that was his father. The nurse told him his father was found in horrible condition and was lucky to be alive. After months of recovery, John was finally able to speak with him. Charles told him that he was being tortured for years. As they caught up, Charles was slowly becoming his old self again. It felt good to have one another. In that time, John had fallen for one of the nurses who helped him. Her name was Adelaide. In late 1865, John and Charles had finally come home. The family was whole again. John was still upset with Christopher after what he said. He refused to speak to him. Gertrude was relieved to have them back, and Charles couldn't be happier to be home. The next year they received a visit. Adelaide had come to check on them. Her and John had rekindled their love. They were married that year and moved just across from his family home. There they lived happily together. Sometimes John would have nightmares of war. Adelaide would comfort him as best she could. In 1868, they were expecting their first child. The young couple were excited to soon meet their bundle of joy. Months later, they welcomed their little girl. They named her Doris Hathaway. She was a wonderful addition to the family. In 1871, they had another little girl. Her name was Linda Hathaway. Besides the nightmares, John was incredibly grateful for the life he had. He wouldn't trade it for anything else. Chasa Chavez was born in the year 1838. He is Muriel and Conecataco Chavez's only child. The very night he was born, his grandfather was killed, while his first few days was filled with his grandfather's mourning. His family was grateful for the miracle that was he, especially his grandmother Eleanor. She took care of him while his mother recovered from the birth. Her attachment to him helped her grieve. Eleanor spent more time with him than his parents. She loved him dearly. She was always teaching him something. Her greatest lesson was the importance of family. Every week the family gathered for storytelling. Even after her passing, the gatherings continued. But Eleanor wasn't the only important figure in Chaskas' life. He was close with his uncle Doke. He was like an older brother. His parents taught him about responsibility. He helped with the garden and animals. That included the horses. His parents bred their horses so that he could have a horse of his own. He named him Sailor. Until the foal was old enough to ride, he would practice with Freya. Doke would supervise him. When he wasn't doing that, he would play with his cousin Tayanitas. Years went by and Chaska continued his daily routine. Despite the consistency, he was never bored. The family still gathered every week for storytelling. Now that Sailor was older, Chaska was able to take him on rides. He would go horse riding with his parents every day. Every now and then, Chaska would visit Eleanor's grave to catch her up on family matters. He took Sailor everywhere. One day while he was out, he noticed a girl. She was incredibly beautiful. She noticed him too. They started talking. Her name was Julie. She admired his horse. The more they spoke, the more he liked her. Her feelings were mutual, so they scheduled a date. While they were talking, they were noticed by someone. The old man yelled at her about being unfaithful to him. Then, he took her away. Later that night, Chaska returned to the place he had first seen her. That was when she told him everything. The man who was with her was her husband, who she was forced to marry at just 15. He treated her poorly. Chaska promised to protect her, thus beginning an affair between them. Whenever her husband was away, they would spend time together. Sometimes she would visit his house. Sometimes he'd visit her and find the marks her husband left. When Julie announced that she was pregnant, Chaska thought it was over for them, but Julie promised that nothing would change. He was relieved to hear that from her, but he was concerned on how they would make it work. She knew it'd be unsafe for him to come over, so she promised she would visit him whenever she could. She did just that. Every few weeks she would come over to spend time with him. They made it work and were very happy. She even attended the family gatherings. Chaska's parents were happy for him, but they didn't understand why he wouldn't move her in. They didn't know that she was married to someone else. After a while, she told him her husband was getting suspicious, so she couldn't see him for some time. So he spent a few days without hearing from her. Then it was a week without a word. Then months. He was worried that something might have happened to her. The only thing that stopped him from seeing her was his fear of her husband. Eventually he couldn't take it anymore. He had to see her. In 1854 he went to her house. Someone else answered the door. He asked to speak with Julie. The woman told him that the people who used to live there had passed away. The husband had died just before Julie's water broke, and she passed during childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. Chaska couldn't believe what he had heard. The woman tried to comfort him, but he was too distraught. When he went home, he got into bed and stayed there for weeks. Not even Muriel could console him. Julie's death was a loss he would never get over. Chaska would spend the rest of his life working on his family's farm. He still lived with his parents and his uncle, and they still had family gatherings. His mother had eventually passed in 1868, and his father later in 1880. Every night he would ride his horse and enjoy the scenery until his death in 1894. Tanita Doen was born in 1837. She is Winona and Poco Dozen's first child. Growing up, she was surrounded by love. Her and her sister would often visit their cousin Chaska and play games. They'd come home just before their grandparents finished preparing dinner. Then they'd play with their dolls before bedtime. Tayanita would always have her dolls fall in love. She wanted the kind of love her parents had. When she was older, she would go into town with her sister and search for love. One night she found what she was looking for. A man by the name of Oak Smith had caught her eye. They started spending a lot of time together. Tayanita made the first move. As things were getting serious, she introduced Oak to her parents. When she wasn't in the room, Oak had asked their permission to marry her. They happily accepted. In 1856, Tayanita and Oak were married. They moved into a small home in the same neighborhood she grew up. They were very happy together. Tayanita's dream of finding love had come true. In 1860, she discovered she was pregnant. Oak wasn't excited to hear the news. She tried to reassure him, but he was still upset. Despite his feelings, Tayanita couldn't wait to meet her little one. Her family was also excited for her. Even though Oak wasn't thrilled about the pregnancy, he was still there for her. He was even there during the labor. He hated seeing her in such agony. He helped as much as he could. After the birth, Oak took care of the baby while Tayanita rested. He tried to bond with the baby, but it was difficult. Tayanita's parents had come over to help him until she was better. Parenting was much easier for her. She loved her child unconditionally. As the months went on, their little girl had grown. Her name was Elena. The family adored her. Tayanita wanted Oak to bond with Elena, so she would leave him alone with her. After a while, Oak had grown to adore her. Tayanita was happy to see them bonding with each other. As the years went on, their bond grew stronger. She was Daddy's favorite girl. They were a happy little family. In 1868, Tayanita and Oak were expecting once more. This time they were both happy at the news. Elena was excited too. Months later, they welcomed another little girl into the world. Her name was Sina. Elena loved to play with her. They were a tight-knit family. At the end of every night, after dinner, and the girls were tucked in, Tayanita would thank Oak for how far he's come. Then they would sit out and watch the stars until they fell asleep. Chilalis Legacy was born in 1840. She is Winona and Poco Legacy's second child. As a child, she was very adventurous. She loved to go off on little adventures by herself. When she was 10 years old, her aunt Enola had come back from a trip out of the country. She told Chilalis how different and fun it was to be somewhere new. Chilalis was so intrigued. She begged her aunt to take her the next time she went. Unfortunately for her, her parents wouldn't allow it. But she would never forget all the incredible things she heard. In 1860, at 20 years old, Chilalis decided to go overseas and see the world. She said her goodbyes to her family before going on her way. It was even better than she imagined. Everything about the country was exciting. There were many beautiful sights and monuments. There was always something new to see. Chilalis happily made herself a home. She had friends who taught her their language and culture. She even had a boyfriend. They lived together in a small apartment. They were happy. But things weren't perfect. Chilalis had caught him in bed with another woman. So she ended things. She moved away and eventually found someone else. This new relationship was much better than her last. She was showered with love and jewels. His name was Cornellas and Abdullah. In 1863, the two of them were married. She moved into his lovely estate. Cornellas spoiled her with his riches. Every day he would buy her flowers, jewels, and garments. He would also sing to her. She loved his voice. In 1865, they were expecting their first child. They had a little girl named Odia. She was their little bundle of joy. Parenting was an adventure of its own. The next year, in 1866, they had another little girl. Her name was Aria. Then, in 1867, Chilalis had one more girl named Mimi. Since the girls were close in age, they always had someone to play with. Ohanzees Doen was born in 1842. He is Winona and Poco Dozen's third child. He had a good upbringing. He spent a lot of quality time with his family. As he got older, his sisters had moved out and gotten married. Ohanzees and his twin brother, Shila, were still at home with their parents. They helped around the house. In 1862, Winona and Poco were bedridden by an illness. They died later that year. Ohanzees and Shila were left with the house. It was a lot quieter without their parents. They spent more time out with their cousin Chaska. Shila would sometimes bring girls home. Ohanzees was impressed with how many women he could swoon. Shila gave him some advice on picking up girls. The next time they went out, he gave it a try. He introduced himself to a woman named Gloria. She agreed to go home with him. Ohanzees was happy to spend a night with a pretty girl. But it became so much more than that. Shila had soon moved away and gotten married. In 1867, Ohanzees and Gloria were married. That same year they found out they were expecting. A few months later they had a son. They named him Colin. Ohanzees loved his baby boy. He made them both so happy. Ohanzees would bring him to his sisters to play with his cousin Zena. They had many play dates. Through the years, Ohanzees and Gloria would try for another baby, but were unlucky. Although they were disappointed, they were grateful to have Colin. They made the most of their only child and cherished every moment with him. They went out a lot. One day, while Ohanzees and Gloria were napping, Colin had wandered off. Nobody noticed him go into the sea until it was too late. Colin Dozen had passed away in 1870. He was 3 years old. His death had affected the entire family, especially his parents. They were really struggling with his loss. There were pieces of him everywhere. There wasn't a place they weren't reminded of him. Ohanzees' siblings had come over to help with anything they needed. Gloria would sleep most days. Other times she would find herself in Coline's room, playing with his toys. It soon became too painful to remember him, so they got rid of his things, until there was nothing left of him. After a few years, they had found hobbies to keep themselves busy. They had also got a dog. His name was Ruger. The days weren't so hard anymore. They would still mourn Colleen, however. Despite their pain, their love never drifted, and it never would. In 1919, Ohanzees and Gloria finally reunited with their son. Shila Doen was born in 1842. He is Winona and Poco Dozen's fourth child. Shortly after his parents had passed, he and his twin brother would go out and meet people. Shila was really good at charming the ladies. Sometimes he'd bring them home for the night. Eventually, one of them revealed she was pregnant. Shila was surprised but ready for parenthood. It was her who wasn't. Her name was Allison, and she was not happy at all. They were married in 1865 and moved into Allison's family estate. Throughout the entire pregnancy, she refused to speak to Shila. She was always drinking. She had later given birth to twins, Iris and Dakota. After the birth, Allison's behavior had become worse. While Shila was struggling to care for two babies at once, she was drinking her life away. Her drinking sometimes made her unpredictable. In the mornings, Shila would leave for work as a laborer. That left Allison alone with the children. Shila would come home after a long day to find that his children had been neglected. He would argue with Allison for not caring for the kids, but she brushed him off. Shila had no choice but to hire a nanny. Having a nanny was incredibly helpful. He finally had the time to take care of himself again. He expressed his gratitude for her in many ways. As the children grew older, they encountered their mother a lot more. Allison would go out of her way to destroy anything that belonged to them, leaving Shila to fix whatever she broke. He tried his best to protect them from her, but he had no control over what happened while he was at work. Luckily for the children, their nanny was always there for them. Shila was forever grateful. Soon Allison had started to suspect they were having an affair. When she discovered the truth, she was infuriated. After beating the nanny, she fired her. Later that night, the couple got into an argument. Allison had been drinking. He explained that the nanny was the only one who helped with the children, but Allison didn't care. She told him the children would be better off dead. She blamed Shila for her misery. By then, the children were used to hearing her say such things. But Allison was so angry. She kicked Shila down the stairs. He landed in front of his kids. They were only 7 years old. Shila was horribly injured, but he could have been saved. All Allison had to do was get help, but she never did. Shila passed away in 1872. He was buried at a local cemetery. Because of how far they lived, his family didn't even know that he died. His children were now left with no one but their wicked mother. Pearl Todakini was born in 1847. She is Delilah and Onakona's first child. Pearl was always independent. She was close with her brother Nokwisi. Every day before sundown, Her father would tell her and her brother the story of their grandfather. Then they would go to bed. They weren't allowed to stay up too late. Sometimes they would go to Onakona's family home for family storytelling. That was the only time they were out past dark. On those nights they would sleep over. The older the children became, the more details Ona would reveal about that night. Nokwisi always had nightmares, but Pearl was never afraid. She loved stories about adventure and would always read up on it. She believed her father's story to be a tale like the books. Pearl liked to go on her own adventures. Ona allowed her to do so as long as she returned before sunset. He would always be waiting when she came home. Even as she grew older, Ona would still watch her leave and wait for her to come back. Pearl would usually spend the whole day out with her horse Coco. She would always lose track of time on her journeys away. When she'd finally come home, she was scolded. But she was still allowed to go out, as long as she returned by sunset. When she disobeyed again, Onakona grounded her. Pearl later argued with him about the curfew. Ona tried to explain the dangers of being out after dark, but she wouldn't listen. She didn't believe his stories. He asked Delilah for help because he didn't know what else to do. So Delilah told Pearl to stop disobeying her father. After being berated by her parents, Pearl would vent to her brother about how unfair they were. But Nokwisi agreed that it was unsafe after dark because of the beast. Pearl teased him for still believing those stories. Later that night, after Delilah and Onakona went to bed, Pearl went into her brother's room and proposed they look for the beast. Of course, Nokwisi said no because it wasn't worth the risk. So Pearl went out on her own to see if her father's tale was true. She found the same woods from his stories. She got off Coco to look around. It seemed peaceful, so she decided to lay down and watch the stars. Then she heard something. Frightened, Coco ran off, leaving Pearl alone in the woods. At home, Nokwisi worried for his sister. He thought about telling his parents, but he didn't want her to get in trouble. So he went after her himself. He didn't like being out after dark, but he was determined to find his sister. Luckily, he found her quick. Pearl was relieved to see him. Nokwisi expressed how worried he was. She assured him everything was fine. But they couldn't go home without Coco. Together they searched for the horse. They started to worry when they couldn't find him. Then they heard something approaching them. They ran when they saw it. They were separated. The creature chased after Nokwisi. Pearl heard her brother's screams and went to look for him. What she found was horrific. Her brother was gone. Pearl returned home alone that night. She woke her parents and told them what happened. Onakona didn't believe her and scolded her for lying, so she brought them to him. Nokwisi Todakini had passed away in 1864. Pearl felt guilty for the pain she had caused her family. If she didn't leave that night, her brother would still be here. Her mother blamed her even more. She would never forgive her. Pearl kept her distance and stayed in her room. The only one who knew what she was going through was Ona. Pearl begged for his forgiveness, but he wasn't mad at her. He told her his stories really were true, and his father was killed by the same beast. Pearl wanted vengeance. She would spend years training to one day confront the beast. Her father didn't want her to get killed, but he couldn't stop her. She spent every night wandering the woods in search for the beasts who hurt her family. During the day she was at the saloon. Many men tried to make a move on her, but she wasn't interested. However, there was one man who caught her attention. Pearl introduced herself and learned his name was Ryder Hyde. He told her he had seen the beast she was looking for. So they sat down to tell each other their experiences. Ryder told her he had fought the beast many times and had the scars to prove it. He knew how to hurt the beast and suggested they hunt together. So every night Pearl and Ryder would search for the beast in the woods. He would bring his horse along to help. Most nights they wouldn't find anything, but they did find love. In 1870 they were married. They moved to a small house outside of town. They spent the next few years searching for the beast. They had a few encounters that were never close enough to try anything. In 1874 they had their first child, a little boy named Jacques. Then they had another baby in 1875, a little girl named Martha. With their growing family, Pearl's cousin Chaska invited them to stay in their old family home. There they had 5 more children. Abraham in 1879, Rosemary in 1881, Mildred in 1882, Jose in 1883, then finally Francis in 1890. Despite all their children, the couple never stopped looking for the beast. They would teach their children to do the same. Marisol Todeschini was born in 1857. She is Esmeralda and Duque Todeschini's first child. Marisol and her siblings had a wonderful childhood. They were given everything they ever wanted. They were the youngest of all cousins, so of course they were spoiled. Marisol loved all things beauty. She enjoyed playing with her mother's makeup. Esmeralda always encouraged it. Her aunt Muriel taught her how to knit, and she fell in love with making clothes. When she was older, her passion for beauty grew. She would always knit an outfit to go with her makeup. Her family eventually invested in a sewing machine, so she could further explore her craft. With all she was making, she had an idea. In 1878, Marisol opened a dress shop. There, she showed off all her creations to the public. She made many sales. Her parents were her best customers. They were so proud of her. Duque made sure to tell her not to give her business away to anyone. At the end of the day, Marisol's store was nearly out of stock. She would spend all night making clothes until sunrise. She even made new designs. One afternoon before she closed, a young man came in. He seemed impressed by the place. He told her he wanted to buy and expand her business, but she wasn't interested. Her father had already warned her about that. While she wasn't interested in his money, she was more interested in his looks. They went on a date to get to know each other. Marisol learned his name was James Harrington. He came from a relatively wealthy family, and all their wealth was passed down to him. He wanted to put the money into something good. While Marisol liked him a lot, she stayed cautious. But the more time she spent with him, the more she started to see how genuine he was. They were fond of each other's company. She introduced him to her parents. He seemed a bit preppy, but they liked him. In 1882 they were married. That same year they bought a house. Business was still going well. James would help her with the shop whenever she needed it. He talked to her about expanding their brand and opening shops across the world. While the idea seemed nice, Marisol was happy with her little shop. Years went on and Marisol's business carried on. While Marisol was happy with the way things were, James wanted a little more. In 1885, Marisol and James were expecting. They soon had a little boy named Everett. He was showered with love. James wanted to give his son everything and more. So he started making toys for him. Then he got an idea. In 1887, he opened his own store next door to Marisol's shop. A toy store. His grand opening was packed. People from all over town had come to buy his toys. Marisol was proud of him. He would sometimes bring Everett to play and explore the shop. The older he became, the more he enjoyed being there. James would have him test out new toys he made. He always gave him something new to play with. In 1888, Marisol had given birth to a baby girl. Her name was Ava. After she was born, James started to work a lot more. If he wasn't at the shop, he was busy crafting new toys, leaving Marisol to care for the children. The less she saw him, the more she worried about what the business was doing to him. When she expressed her worries, he told her that he was working to make more money. She argued that they already had more than enough money, that nothing could change his mind. While his business's success grew with the passing years, he would never get to make up for the lost time with his family. Felipe Todicchini was born in 1859. He is Esmeralda and Duque Todicchini's second child. Growing up, Felipe enjoyed the farm life more than his siblings. He enjoyed taking care of the animals. He liked to help his family in any way he could. When he wasn't working on the farm, he would play with his brother and older cousin Chaska. At 16, his father made his famous wine. As they drank, Duque mentioned that he used to sell his wine before he nearly lost his business. Felipe was so invested that he had Duque show him how to make it. When he gave it a try, Duque was there to coach him. It took him a while to get it right, but he refused to give up until it was perfect. His father was the first to try. He was impressed. Felipe would often bring his drinks out to share with his friends. He gained a lot of popularity from it. So, when he went home, he made more. He added more ingredients to make it stronger. Then he brought it to his friends. They would drink and party all night. His fling was starting to become serious. In 1878, Felipe moved out with his new girlfriend. Her name was Marie. They were married later that year. Felipe continued to make more and more liquor. The couple drank all the time. Marie loved his drinks a little too much. While Felipe enjoyed having all the liquor to him and his wife, he was ready to start selling. He asked his father how to do it. Duque told him to start by selling local. Then once he's made enough money, brand. Following his father's advice, Felipe would sell his liquor to the saloon and other local businesses. After a few years, Felipe was able to brand and sell his products publicly. There were crowds of people lined up to buy his liquor. He sold a lot every day. Unfortunately, Felipe was arrested for not having a permit to distill his alcohol. His pregnant wife Marie was left by herself. In 1882, while Felipe was in prison, Marie had a little girl named Josephine. She kept her mother company while her father was away. For 2 years it was just the two of them. In 1884, Felipe finally returned home. He did his best to make up for the lost time. He didn't want to miss another moment. They were finally a family. They were very happy together. He went back to making the wine from his father's recipe to prevent another arrest. After a few months, it was ready to be sold. His first customer was a young woman named Carrie. He started to tell her about the wine's quality and reasonable pricing, but she was more interested in him than the wine. Flattered, he flirted back. He managed to make a few sales before calling it a night. Carrie followed him home and seduced him while his family was sleeping. Felipe couldn't resist. After that night, he didn't hear from her again. Then she returned with news. She was having his baby and had nowhere to go. Felipe was happy to let her stay, but his wife was furious. Against her wishes, he invited Carrie into their home. Marie wasn't happy at all with her being there. She made that very clear, that Carrie meant no harm. She did what she could to help around the house. But it didn't matter what she did. Marie made sure to tell her that her stay wasn't permanent. Soon in 1885, Carrie had a little girl. Her name was Cassandra. Felipe liked having both of his kids under the same roof, so Carrie wasn't going anywhere. She tried to be friendly with Marie, but she would curse her out. She told her she hated her. Felipe would argue with her about treating Carrie better, but Marie wasn't having it. She wanted her out. In 1887, Carrie was pregnant again. By then, Marie had enough. She told Carrie she could no longer stay with them. She cried to Felipe and he assured her that she could stay. He yelled at Marie for trying to kick her out when she had no place to go. That she was tired of living with his mistress and her bastard child. It wasn't fair. Felipe continued to let Carrie stay against her wishes once again. The stress caused Marie to drink more than usual, which then caused her to hurt Carrie. In doing so, she had taken the life of her unborn child. Carrie was absolutely devastated. She remained in her room for days, refusing to eat. Felipe didn't know what to do to help her. He cursed Marie for what she did and told her to leave. Marie couldn't believe he was kicking her out. He meant every word. He wouldn't even allow her to say goodbye to their daughter. Before she left, Carrie stopped her. She told Felipe that it wasn't right to kick her out, especially since they were still married with a child. Even though Carrie was still upset for what she did, she knew that someday she would forgive her. Felipe was fine with her staying, as long as Carrie was okay with it. Marie was relieved she didn't have to go, but she still had hard feelings. She would never get used to having her around. Javier Todequini was born in 1861. He is Esmeralda and Doca Todequini's final child. Shortly after his Aunt Muriel passed, her husband started to play the guitar. Javier loved to watch and would listen to him for hours. He begged Coneco to teach him and he accepted. So at 9 years old he got his first lesson. Coneco made sure to teach him all he knew. The better he became, the more they would play together. Javier would also perform for his family. Javier also enjoyed singing when he wasn't playing. As the years went on, He wrote lyrics to go with his tunes. He would play for Conocataco, who had become too ill to play on his own. He started to play more in public spaces. He liked to perform for his family at the park. One afternoon, just before he went home for the night, he was approached by a girl. Her name was Annabelle and she liked him a lot. So they started dating. Javier continued to perform at the park for entertainment. He performed so much that he started getting paid for it. Eventually, he had the money to take a trip out of the country with his parents. On their last day at the beach, there was a woman who caught his eye. He introduced himself. Despite the language barrier, he managed to learn her name was Palala. She introduced him to her culture and traditions, and he showed her his musical prowess. They had become close friends overnight. Before Javier left to go home the next day, he returned to the beach hoping to see her there. Lucky for him she was. They said their final goodbyes. Palala gave him a gift to always remember her by. After he got home, things felt different. Javier couldn't stop thinking about Palala. He missed her a lot. Even when he was with his girlfriend, he was sad. He started to write a song about her. It helped him feel better. He worked on it all day and night until it was finished. He ended things with Annabelle. She didn't take it very well. Javier went on to perform his new song at the park. At home, he read books to learn Palala's language. He soon saved enough to go back to the island. His parents wished him luck before he went on his way. After 2 years apart, he was finally able to see Palala again. She was so happy to see him. He told her he was there to stay. She brought him to her home where she allowed him to stay. The two had grown closer through the years. They were friends for a while. They were both in love but too afraid to confess it. It was Javier who made the first move. He sang the song he wrote for her every night. They were married in 1884. They spent another couple of years enjoying each other. They soon discovered that they were expecting. Then in 1886 they welcomed their son into the world. His name was Mania. His parents adored him. Every day Javier would sing to his family the same way he used to.